Okay, welcome to our second week of Introduction to Research Methods. I'm Dr. Freddy Aviles, as you guys know. Today, we're going to be talking about getting started in research. Okay, I told you guys last week at the end of the lecture that there was that part at the end that was called the research process, and that I wasn't going to go over that, so I just pointed it out. That's because we go through the research process as we go through the semester. Okay, so let's get started with chapter 2, getting started in research, and see part of that research process, and then go into whatever we need to talk about. Okay, here's our overview. Okay, we're going to talk about this. So we're going to talk about the first couple of steps in the research process. Actually, the second step, I don't think we're going to get to. We take a full week for this chapter, so today's lecture only covers the first part, how to find a research idea, and then do some searching, okay, of the research, the literature, basically. Okay, so step one, try to find an idea. What are you going to do for your research project? Okay, remember, in this class, you actually have to do your own research. You're not just going to read about research. You're going to do your own study. Okay, so the first step is to find an idea and then eventually come up with a hypothesis. So let's keep going. That's just our overview. Getting started. How can you get started? Okay, how do you find an idea? It might seem simple, but when you're just starting off in research, it can be a bit daunting. I remember my first research project, it was actually when I was still an undergrad as an honor student, and I was there talking with the professor, my advisor at the time, and I couldn't think of anything, and sometimes students come to me for that, and I know, what do? I have no idea. This chapter actually covers where you can get some of those ideas. So one thing you can do to find an idea is to pick a topic in which you're interested, right? There's a reason you took a psychology class in the first place. Okay, so there must be something you're interested in. Maybe it's marijuana, maybe it's aggression, maybe it's alcoholism, maybe it's, dementia or autism or something. Pick a topic in which you're interested. Some examples here, it could be a group of individuals. Maybe you're interested in, grandmothers, older women, basically. Or maybe just older people in general. Okay? Or maybe a particular behavior like overeating. Or maybe drinking, smoking weed, whatever it is. I do want to point out that, not really going to call it weed when you search for stuff, but that's what people call it in the vernacular, street language, so to speak. It could be a general topic like aging, it could be autism or something else. But there are many different things. Remember when you took that Psych 101 class, right? You covered many different things. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of topics in the index, of all these things that are covered. So it's easy actually to think of something, okay? So that's a starting point. Pick something in which you're interested, okay? And then do your homework. You're going to collect background information. You're going to read books, journal articles, Don't try to read everything, of course. Just read enough to get a good grasp of the subject. Okay, let the reading kind of guide you. At the beginning, just pick a topic and then go read about it and see what sparks your interest. Because when you do read about something, when you pick a topic, especially if it's a general topic like just depression or something like that, you're going to find so much information, and eventually you're going to have to narrow it down. Don't try to read everything. I would suggest you start with a good book, okay, and look at the chapters. Look at what the topics are, skim some of those chapters that seem more interesting, and then go from there. Journal articles are going to be more specific, okay? But you can also look at those, and we will be looking at those eventually. Okay, let's keep going. When you are trying to pick a topic, or maybe you have picked a topic and you're looking for information on that topic just to get a general idea of what the literature says about that topic, keep an open mind, okay? Just know that, it may lead you down a path you weren't anticipating. You may actually end up changing your mind and decide that you don't want to look into that topic anymore. You don't want to do your project on that. Maybe you want to do something else. Okay. So keep an open mind. Things can change. Okay. So begin with a general topic and let the background reading guide you, like I said, right? Be critical. Ask questions as you read, right? Maybe you're reading about, let's say, violent video games. Let's say you're interested in that. Okay. And ask questions as you read, you know, you know, are these video games really violent enough? Or, you know, how is this study being done? Is this an experiment? Is this a survey? Is this really valid? You know, is it really showing that violent video games actually cause aggression? Or are they really just showing that there's a correlation there, there's an association? Or maybe you're interested in a marijuana study. And you could ask yourself, you know, when you read about these particular studies, you know, what is the dose that they're using? You know, what is enough basically to get people high? Or if they're studying the effect on marijuana on memory, say, how are they really testing memory? And is this really valid? Okay. So be critical, ask questions. And that's why it's a good idea to pick something in which you're interested in, because when you're really interested in something, you really think about it more carefully. Maybe you don't agree with the research, but keep an open mind. Maybe the research will change your mind, okay? Or maybe you'll just find that, you know, there's some problems with it. So keep an open mind, okay? Be critical, ask questions. Maintain a degree of flexibility. Like I said, you may actually change your mind, okay? You may decide that the topic is just too complex. Maybe you're interested in Alzheimer's or something like that, because let's say you have a grandma that has Alzheimer's. And then you start reading about it, and then you realize, you know, there's a lot of complex, very advanced biological stuff that they're talking about, and you have no idea what they're talking about. You have no idea what those parts of the brain are, or those pathways, those chemicals. So you decide, you know, maybe I don't want to actually look into this. I don't have the expertise necessary. But maybe if I want to still keep the topic of, you know, Alzheimer's, maybe I want to look at how caring for people with Alzheimer's, maybe I want to look at that, caring for people with Alzheimer's and the stress and the difficulty it causes, you know, the caregivers or those that are caring for those individuals. Maybe you want to focus on that, which is more psychological rather than just the biology. Focus, 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 it says, right? Develop one research question, right? And find relevant background information. So as you read about your topic, you're gonna basically begin to funnel your search. You're gonna focus on certain things. So let's say you start out being interested in depression. And you read first about, like, let's say, you know, what depression is, the symptoms and all that stuff. And then you read about how it causes problems in, you know, with work, and also how it causes problems with social relationships. How it, you know, also affects the brain and makes it harder to basically to remember things, to think critically, and all those things. You read about various different things, okay? So you're gonna wanna focus, you know, what is it about depression that you wanna study? Do you wanna study maybe just the symptoms and, you know, how common they are, how severe they are, that kind of stuff? Or maybe you decide to focus on how depression affects, you know, social relationships, how it makes, you know, basically relationships more difficult, because people who are depressed are very irritable. They're very grouchy. Okay, they're very hard to deal with. So you're gonna have to narrow down your focus and maybe decide that you're not just gonna, you know, read about depression in general, but you're gonna read about how depression affects people's social relationships, or how depression affects you academically. Okay, so you're gonna eventually narrow down your search. Take it one step at a time. Okay, start out general and let the reading guide you, and then decide that you're gonna focus on more specific things. Let's talk more about these research ideas. Where can they come from? Because I just said, you know, that maybe they can come from, you know, let's say a personal interest of yours, you know, like something you're interested in. Okay, so it's a personal interest, just something you're curious about. You know, something that you've noticed. People are depressed, and their lives falling apart around them, and all the things that can happen. So pick something which you're actually interested in, something you want to learn more about. I mentioned that, right? Or you can start with a casual observation, right? Maybe it's not something you're so much interested in, but something you noticed, okay? And maybe you want to learn more about that. So, the behavior of people usually will spark some ideas, all right? Or maybe even the behavior of animals, like looking at your cat can, believe it or not, spark some ideas. Like behavior of people, you may notice when you're out walking around, especially, when you were walking around the college campus, that certain people hold hands and, are kind of affectionate, show public displays of affection, the hugging and the kissing. And there are other couples that do not. Why are they different? Why the difference? So you observe that, and maybe you want to look into that more. Maybe it has something to do with the kind of the age of the relationship. Maybe early on, people are a little bit more insecure, and they're a little bit more touchy, a little bit kind of all over each other, like saying, like, this one's mine, so I'm going to hold her hand. I'm going to give her a peck every now and then. And maybe people who have been around longer, who have been together longer, maybe they're not that insecure, and they don't need to hold hands, and they don't show public displays of affection that much. They've had plenty of time to show affection, and they're kind of used to each other, and they just don't show affection that often. Okay. So those are just, some ideas. You might want to look into that. Like even animals can spark, ideas that you might want to look into. So maybe you notice that there, around your home, that there are some stray cats that come around. And since they're strays and nobody really takes care of them that much, they look, a little bit more dirty, more messy than, your well-groomed house cats. So maybe that sparks an idea, Are there differences, let's say, in grooming habits, between people, let's say, who are, well cared for, let's say, people who are wealthy, and let's say those that are homeless? And what about the ones in the middle class people? Maybe you notice something like that, okay? And maybe that sparks an idea, okay? Reports of other people's observations. Somebody maybe tells you about something they noticed, okay? Maybe somebody noticed, a fight that broke out at a local bar. And since at a bar, people were drinking, so you figure, maybe there is something to alcohol, making people more aggressive. So you decide to look into that. Or other people's observations can also be things that you have seen on TV, on the internet, or even newspapers, magazines that you've read, okay? I don't know who reads newspapers and magazines anymore, but we used to have actual physical versions of that, on paper, and now everything's online. They still exist, but they're online. The New York Times is online now, and so are all these magazines that used to be published and, actually printed physically. Academic journals, when you read about, research studies, whether it's in a book or an actual research article, those are other people's observations. Those are things that other people have noticed that they decided to test. All this can spark an idea. Let's keep going. Or so the first part, we're kind of just talking about ideas. I know I mentioned, searching for things, but I realize now that was just kind of still part of our outline, okay? Because first we talk about ideas, and we'll talk about how to search for things. So something else that can spark an idea are those practical problems or questions, okay? It could be a practical problem, something that you notice that just needs some attention, that needs to be solved. Like the problem, for instance, of, people, rushing to the grocery store when there's, some kind of a health scare, a pandemic. You might have noticed that at Costco or at stores. That might be a practical problem. How do we solve that when, for the future, when there's another problem? How can we keep people from hoarding things? Hoarding is also a problem, that's related to that. Where it might not be during a pandemic or anything like that, but that some people tend to hoard things, whether it's books or plants or junk. Maybe they like working on cars and they buy junk cars and parts for those junk cars that they hope someday they're going to fix, and they just hoard things and they never really fix anything. Okay, but these may be problems for some people. Maybe it's an eyesore for the community, all this bunch of junk, or it's a problem like a pandemic where there's some health scare or something like that, and people are hoarding toilet paper, or they're hoarding things like cleaning supplies, and then those things are hard to find for others. Okay, what's going on there, and how can we prevent that, right? Because when people hoard things, then it's harder for other people to find those things. Okay, or other problems. You might have noticed that something that is called illegal dumping, where people tend to kind of collect their junk, or they want to clean up their yard because they've been hoarding a bunch of junk and decide they're going to clean it up, or maybe construction site or something like that. Where instead of taking the junk to the to the dump, some people just dump it in some empty lot somewhere. Okay, or on the side of the road. That's a practical problem that could be solved. Okay, those are all problems that maybe you might want to study, and a lot of those actually have been studied. It's going to be nearly impossible, by the way, to think of something that has not been studied. So don't try to come up with something completely new something that someone has never thought of. Okay, the chances of you coming up with that are really slim. It's just especially if it's a practical problem. Okay, something that affects people. There's a lot of intelligent people out there doing research, and chances are, if you have an idea, somebody has thought about it in some way or tried to tackle it. But that doesn't mean you can't, try to solve the same problem or look at the same problem. Illegal dumping is still going on. Okay, so we haven't really solved that problem, but there's plenty of research that has been done. Okay, there's research on hoarding, right? People who hoard things, or during a pandemic or something like that, and because we've been kind of living through this, we know now that to some extent, one thing that seems to cause hoarding is anxiety. Okay, people are scared. People are anxious about whether they're going to be able to find certain things, whether life is going to be disrupted and they're going to stop producing certain things. So people become anxious, fearful about certain things, and then they hoard those things. So maybe the people who hoard things, who are not really hoarding things because of a pandemic, they just hoard things, throughout their lives. Maybe they have something, some insecurity, some anxiety. Maybe they've had some trauma in their life, and that's why they hoard things. Okay, that's just an idea. Okay, there's a couple of categories of research. Okay, there's applied research and basic research. The applied research would be that's when you actually try to solve a practical problem. Okay, so just to give you some terminology there, that's called applied research, and there's plenty of people who do that. And there's also basic research where they just study something that's theoretical. Like for instance, does alcohol cause aggressive behavior? Now there's thousands of studies, maybe tens of thousands, that have already confirmed that that have looked at that. That doesn't mean that you can't do your research on that and do some kind of survey or something. But there are plenty of studies that have been done, on that topic. But it's a theoretical one. Now, if you try to actually solve the problem, right? Keep people from becoming aggressive. When people drink, to try to circumvent that or short circuit that or fix that problem, then that would be basic research. But if you're just interested in, does this really happen? Does alcohol really cause aggressive behavior? Then that would be basic research. Okay, it's just something theoretical. It's already we already know, okay, that yes, alcohol does cause aggressive behavior. And by the way, you wouldn't show that it causes aggressive behavior when you do a survey, okay? That would just show you that maybe there's some kind of correlation or maybe the symptoms of drinking too much, whatever it is, but that wouldn't tell you that it causes the behavior, okay? There are behavioral theories as well, just theories that predict behavior, okay? Alcohol is one of those, right? Alcohol and aggression, or maybe there's behavioral theories that, there's, for instance, social learning theory, for instance. It's just a theory that says that that our behavior basically comes from the observations that we make, that we tend to do the things that we see. We grow up around certain people, so therefore we're likely to become those people. If your father was an alcoholic, maybe your family around you is an alcoholic, your mother, your father, right? Your uncles, your aunts, then you're very likely to grow up to be an alcoholic yourself. Okay, because you tend to copy their behavior. Those are behavioral theories. So these ideas can come from many sources. Let's keep going. Now, eventually, you're going to have to just pick something and do some reading. Okay, and I don't suggest that you wait. Okay, that long, by the way. Okay, we're talking about this now, so I suggest that you try to pick a topic. Try to think of something soon and start reading. It's never too early to start. Okay, don't wait until the middle of the semester when we're close to having things due. Okay, don't do that. Okay, because there's going to be things due throughout. Okay, so you want to do a literature search. So you want to search the literature. Now, what the heck is the literature? Okay, so the literature is the mass of published information worldwide. It's the stuff that's written. Okay, but nowadays, not everything is just written in an actual book that's bound, a hard copy. A lot of things are on the internet. Okay, so it's the mass of published information worldwide. Okay, it includes books, journal articles. Those are the ones I want you to stick to. There's other things, but I don't want you to do some Google search, okay, or search Wikipedia or something like that. Okay, I want you to learn to use the tools that are available at your library. So we're mostly just going to stick to books and journal articles, because first of all, we want to find the things that are more worthwhile. Okay, sometimes when you look for things on the internet and you do some search, even if it's a website and it seems to have legitimate research presented there, well, whoever put that together, if it's legitimate research, then they've read it somewhere, maybe a book or another journal article or something. So I want you to go to the real sources, okay? Not some website. Okay, websites are not as credible. That doesn't mean they're all wrong, but start with but focus on the things that are actually more credible. So your job is to start with a general idea, and I've explained that, right? And then search the existing literature to gather background information. Okay, but when you're searching for something, eventually you want to, do some reading and narrow it down to a specific research question. I mentioned that before. You eventually want to narrow it down. You want to focus. Now, there are primary and secondary sources. A lot of you already know what these are, right? The primary sources, we're talking about firsthand reports of authors, people who were there when something happened, okay? So let's say if you're reading about World War II and it's a firsthand report, it would be something like a letter written by someone who was alive at the time and who wrote a letter to their loved one somewhere, or maybe their loved one was in the army or the military, some part of the military, and some wife wrote a letter to her husband and how scared she was, and that hoping that she's okay, and then the husband wrote a letter back, about what was going on. That would be a primary source, someone who was actually there when that happened. For psychology, it's a little bit different, okay? For psychology, these primary sources, these firsthand reports, we're talking about empirical journal articles or a thesis, something like that. So basically a research article, a research study. That's a primary source. So here's the thing. Somebody did some research, okay? They did some experiment to determine whether alcohol increases aggression. And, the author or authors of that research study, well, they are primary sources. Their research article is a primary source, okay? Primary source of information. They were there, they did the study, okay? So that's what we mean by a primary source when it comes to psychology. It's people who have done kind of their own work. They were the ones who did it. Now the secondary sources are different. Secondary sources are secondhand reports in which the authors discuss someone else's observations. So if we're talking about history, a secondary source would be a history book, a book written about those people who were there during World War II. For psychology, a secondary source is merely a book written by an author who didn't do the research. He is reporting, or she is reporting, about somebody else's research. So he or she is summarizing the work of others. Okay? Your textbooks, your Psych 101 textbooks, or some other psychology textbook for some other class. Okay? And also the introductory section of these research reports. When you read a research report, the introductory section actually is summarizing other people's work. So you have a secondary source within a primary source. But it's your secondary sources are basically descriptions written by others of the work done by, the work done by those other people. So they are summaries, description, or a synopsis of work or observations that have been done by others. So primary sources would basically be your research articles, the actual research reports. You're reading the study done by someone. It's going to have a title page, an abstract, an introduction, a method, results section, discussion, and references. Okay, your secondary sources are books that are written to summarize other people's work. Let's keep going. That shouldn't have taken that long. When you search the literature, you have two basic goals, okay? One is to gain a general familiarity with the area that you're looking into, okay? And two is to find a small set of studies that serve as the basis for your research idea. So you're going to become familiar with your topic, and then you're going to basically narrow it down and say, you know what, I'm really interested in this part of it. And then you're going to try to find a small set of studies that deal with that part of the topic. So you start out by reading about maybe depression in general, and you read about symptoms, you read about how it affects people at work, how it affects people's relationships, how it affects people academically, and you decide, you know what, I'm going to school and myself, and I wonder if I was depressed, would it really be harder for me, to do well? So you decide that you're going to find some studies that deal specifically with that. Okay, the book, let's say, mentioned that. You start out with a book, and then you're going to find some specific studies that look at basically depression and how it affects people academically. So maybe how depression affects, let's say, your ability to remember things, how it affects your ability, let's say, to just get a degree. Maybe it lowers your GPA. You're going to focus on a specific set of studies that deal with that idea, that how depression would affect you, let's say, in school or academically. So those are your two basic goals. Become familiar with the topic, and then let it guide you to something that is more directly about what you're going to be studying. So you want to find a set of published reports defining the current state of knowledge. When you do a literature search, yes, you want to find out, okay, where are we at with this topic? So let's say you're interested specifically in, in how research, in how depression affects people academically. So you read about that, let's say, because you've narrowed it down, and you want to find out, okay, what does the current research say about this? Okay, and you find, you find recent research. Eventually, you want to focus on stuff that's research. What is the current state of knowledge? And maybe you find that there is a lot of research out there, but it's done mostly let's say, at the university level, that it's done at these prestigious schools, like, the UCLA or, USC or something like that, that it's mostly done at those levels. And maybe you find that there's a gap, that there's not much research that looks at, how depression affects community college students. So maybe you decide to do your work on that. Try to identify some kind of gap in the research, something that seems to be missing. And I will tell you that it's hard to find something that's missing, because when you find something worth studying, chances are there's been a lot of research done. It's hard to think about, what's really missing. If you think something is missing, it's probably because you haven't searched for it. But there's been so much work that's been done. that you may not be able to do that. You don't really have to fill in the missing gap, so to speak. It's easier for someone who is actually an expert in the field, who's been doing research for a while, to know how to do that, because they're aware of, the entire literature. They're experts. They know what's being done, what's current, and, they know where it needs to head next. But it's going to be hard for you to find a gap. But I will tell you that for the most part, the research that is done in psychology is mostly done at the upper levels. It's done basically with, it's the research usually done at more prestigious institutions. We don't really do research here at the community college level. And the participants tend to be mostly basically students who go to those institutions. So they mostly focus on students who are relatively well off economically. So it might be worthwhile to look at whether, they've actually have done this research with people who are, not so well off economically, people who are poor, people who go to community college where we have more of a poor population, or even people of color. You'd be surprised, right? How, that this research is mostly done with people who are relatively well off and relatively white, because that is where the research is done. That is mostly what you have at these prestigious institutions. You have white people who are relatively well off, who are mainly the ones who get in there and who go there. There is some diversity, but not a whole lot. Believe it or not, it's very little. And if they really wanted to look at something, looking at a more diverse population, they really have to go out there and make an effort to go into those neighborhoods, go into those other places and find those places, okay? And I've read some research where they attempt to do that, and even then, often they don't succeed, because they end up, okay, so we're gonna do this research, out of Starbucks so we can find a more diverse population. But they end up going to the Starbucks in the white neighborhood. And again, they end up finding nothing but white people for the most part, just a few, black people there and a Latino or an Asian here and there. And that's about it. Even when they try, often they fail at this, right? To include diverse populations, because they don't really go to those places where it's really diverse, okay? So there might be a gap there. Most of the research that has been done is really, with white people, specifically white women, to tell you the truth. Why? Because that's mostly who takes psychology classes. It's white women. When you go to the upper levels, right? When you go to the universities and stuff like that, women are more interested in psychology than men. Actually, women are getting more advanced degrees than men nowadays, and they're more likely to be a bigger portion of the college population. Like 60% are women at the even at our college here. More women are going to college than men. So there's more women. And then as you go to the higher levels, what the research has done, there's more white people. So it's going to be mostly white women who are basically the participants in a lot of these research studies. Okay, so there might be an opportunity there to look at research from a perspective of more diverse populations. But I will tell you that even that seems like it, like something that would be missing, but there's a lot of people looking into that as well. But there is an opportunity there, okay, if you know how to find it. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You could just, it's okay if you do something that's already been done. And the fact that you are a student at an institution that is more diverse, right? And that basically more diverse, not just culturally, not just in regards to ethnicity, but also when it comes to income. It's not just wealthy people who go. There's actually very few, okay? But there is middle class, and there are plenty of people who are lower class, and the lower class are often ignored when it comes to research. So there's not enough. There are opportunities here to look at different populations, okay? And that itself could be new research. But it doesn't have to be new. Your research doesn't have to be new. You could look at an existing question, something that's been tackled before, and you just, replicate the study or do your own version of it. Here's just an example of how, not just an example, a visual here, an image that shows kind of like this thing that looks like a tree without any leaves. And it's trying to explain how new research grows out of old research. So if you go back, you'll, to the bottom of the tree there, to the stem, what you'll find is that there's basically some historical studies. There was very few research being done let's say like in the 50s, or even in the 40s, if you go back that far. Psychology is a relatively young science. And there are some studies there that you may find, and those are historical studies. Okay, some of the first ones that were done when the science was kind of brand new, and then that led to other research, and then eventually it branched off into different directions. Okay, and then the little individual points at the top, that would be the current research, what's happening now. And as you can see, it's branched off in different directions. This is true for any field. And when you're going to tackle a specific question, you're going to be looking at one of those little tiny stems or twigs on the branch, so to speak. I can explain a little bit as to how this works with my area of expertise, which is aggression. Research on aggressive behavior, because I've studied that a lot. But some of those early studies, where believe it or not, have to do with Freudian theory. Freud was a very dominant figure in his time, and he lived from like the late 1800s to like 1940s around there, or close, somewhere around there. When he proposed this theory, it really took off, made him very famous, very popular. So a lot of those early studies were looking at some Freudian things, how keeping things bottled up inside might lead to, to aggressive behavior. And then there's one very important study that was done, and I don't remember the exact date, might have been in the 50s or maybe in the 60s. Somebody proposed what they call the, they were doing some research, and they proposed a theory called, or a hypothesis called the frustration aggression hypothesis, which says that whenever you get frustrated, you're going to become aggressive. And that was a very important kind of hypothesis that was proposed that led to a bunch of research being done, because people challenged it right away. They say, hey, wait a minute, frustration doesn't always lead to aggression. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And then that led to the field kind of branching off in different directions, because it led to so much other research. So I've said too much about that already, about this, but that's just an example how new research kind of grows out of old research. And that's, that's in any field. Okay, we start out with a kind of a narrow, narrow focus. It's just a little bit of research happening in one specific area, and then it branches out. Okay, believe it or not, what led to a lot of research, or a lot of work being done in psychology, was actually World War II, because a lot of soldiers started coming back traumatized, not just physically damaged, but also often mentally damaged, and that led to a lot of work, a lot of emphasis in psychology. Really led to the growth of the field. But I was describing aggressive research in general when it comes to this tree. But in general, psychology has kind of evolved and branched off, and now we have so many different areas. Okay, preparing for your literature search. So before you do your search, right, you want to narrow down your idea to something specific. Okay. So you're interested in something, again, let's say it's depression, but what is it about depression you're interested in? Because, depression affects people in many different ways. It relates to a lot of different things. So maybe, like I said, maybe before you narrow things down, maybe look at a book, right? Skim through some of the chapters, and maybe it'll lead to some ideas, but eventually you want to narrow it down, okay? You're going to want to narrow it down and get to something more specific. So you want to find published information to document and support, the question you're interested in. Maybe depression affects people academically. So go find some research on that, okay? And I guarantee you'll find some, okay? And if you have trouble, talk to me and I can give you some pointers. Although I'm not an expert on everything, okay? And, I was trained in something different, but I know how to use the tools that you have available to do some searches. But the more you use it, the better you get at it. Okay. So those of you who are brand new might have a little bit of difficulty finding what you're looking for, but trust me, it's there. Sometimes you just need to use the right keywords to do your search. A good starting point is recently published secondary sources. Remember, your secondary sources are books, textbooks, right? chapter headings or, chapters. Start with a good book, like I said, and kind of let that, sort of guide you. Learn about things in general, and then you might want to focus on a specific area, something described in a specific chapter. I seem to repeat myself a lot, but that's just the way it is, I guess. Make notes about the following items, okay? Write down those subject words. You'll find out what things are called, okay? So, when let's say you're reading about marijuana, let's say you're interested in that, okay? Guess what? They don't use the keyword, weed, okay? Or whatever else, the street lang is, I don't even know that many, okay? I just, I'm not that young, not that hip, not really into that. But you got to use the right words, okay? Or, like if let's say you're interested in alcoholism or alcoholics, right? Yeah, alcoholics is a good term, right? But drunks is not, okay? You're not going to do research on drunks. You're going to do research on alcoholics. Or let's say you're interested in people who live, close to 100 years of age, around there. Those are called centenarians, okay? They're not called geezers or super old people, so you have to find the right words. As you're reading about the topic, you'll see how things are described, and you need to learn what some of those words are called. You need to learn some of those words so that you can enter the correct words when you actually do a more specific search. So list the correct terms or subject words. Write these words, identify and describe the variables in the study and the characteristics of participants. Yeah, so sometimes it's the variables, right? It's depression, it's alcohol, it's marijuana. These are the variables. These are the things that are being studied, that are being manipulated. And sometimes it's the participants, the centenarians, okay? Or postmenopausal women, or whatever it is. Maybe you're interested in specific people, but you need to know the right keywords, or you might not find much, okay? Author names, maybe you want to write down some author names. If you do plenty of reading on a certain subject, what you'll find is that there's certain names that come up again and again. And these are probably some of the leaders in the field. Some of the people who are doing some of the better known people whose research is very influential, and people who are cited a lot, who are mentioned a lot. Maybe you want to find things that are work that is specifically done by these individuals, or do a search by name and put in the author's name, because let's say there's a certain person who you keep encountering. Maybe the name is Berkowitz. When you're reading about aggressive behavior, the name Berkowitz keeps coming up. So maybe you might want to do an author search, right? And search L. Berkowitz, and then you'll find a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of publications that have to do with aggressive behavior. Yes, Leonard Berkowitz, L. Berkowitz is one of the biggest names in aggressive research. And you'll encounter other names as well. If you're interested in research on aggressive behavior, on basically violent video games and how they are connected to aggressive behavior, the last name Anderson, that's one of the bigger names in that research. And I know this because it's my area, aggressive behavior. So I know a lot of the research, and I know some of the big names, okay? But I don't know big names in a lot of the areas, a lot of the other areas. But as you read about things, you're going to encounter certain names again and again, and those are likely some of the leading authors in the field. The leading experts are some of the people who are more well-known. They have published hundreds of articles and maybe written dozens of books. So you'll encounter them again and again. All right, so now let's actually talk about how do we actually do the search, okay? You need to search these things called databases, and nowadays they're all online. These online databases. Luckily for you guys, you don't actually have to physically go to any library, okay? There are databases now online. A lot of these books, articles have been scanned and just put online. And these are called online databases, okay? So a typical database contains about 1 million publications. That's probably outdated. There's many, many more now, okay? When I first started teaching this course, that's what it said. No, there's many millions now, okay? millions and millions of publications, okay? They're cross-referenced by subject words and author names. So yes, the subject words, the keywords, author names, that's how you can find a lot of these publications. You need to know the right authors or the right words, okay? You can search the database, okay, by subject word or the author name. Like I said, that's kind of redundant there, but articles in the search may be, you might find brief summaries, just a summary of the article, or it might be the abstract, which is a summary of what was done of the study, okay, of the article, or you might find the full text version. I recommend that, of course, you look at the full text version, and I'll show you guys how to find that. It's actually very easy now to find full text version because just about everything's available online. And it used to be in the past that you only found summaries or abstracts. Nowadays, almost everything is online. So it's a lot easier to find these full text articles, even books. And you don't have to physically go somewhere. You just need an internet connection, hopefully a fast internet connection, and you can search for a lot of things, find a lot of things, okay? One of these databases is called PsycInfo. Now, what you're going to use at the college is not called PsycInfo, but I'll describe PsycInfo because, you know, you may be using it somewhere, maybe when you transfer, or maybe you're searching PsycInfo and you don't even know it, okay? It might be called something different depending on what you use. So PsycInfo is the American Psychological Association's, the APA's definitive source for abstracts, scholarly journal articles, book chapters, books, dissertations. So PsycInfo is owned by the American Psychological Association. Okay, it's the largest resource devoted to peer-reviewed literature in behavioral science and mental health. Okay, so it's the largest resource for basically peer-reviewed, scientific research studies, articles that have to do with psychology. So behavioral science and mental health. So things that have to do with psychology. And there's also Psych Articles. Psych Articles is, again, owned by the American Psychological Association, but Psych Articles are full text. The definitive source for full text, peer-reviewed, scholarly, and scientific articles in psychology. Not sure there's a distinction now between PsycInfo and Psych Articles. Everything now is online, so why would you want to search for something? It's just an abstract. So, now everything's online. Okay, so when you actually search this stuff, PsycInfo or whatever it is, if you have access to that, you're going to access full text stuff now. So I'm not sure there's a distinction, or maybe it's just called PsycInfo now. So it says it contains more than 163 articles. That's outdated, okay? There's more and more research that is done every year. Every year, there's probably hundreds of thousands of studies that are published. If we're talking about, all the different fields. In psychology, I mean, there's just a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know how many, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that's published every year. 80 different journals. There's probably more than that now, okay? There's just more every year. The research in the field, in any field, is actually exploding, okay? That's just the way it is. We're now a civilization based on information. And there's a lot of people doing research, a lot of people doing science, a lot of things getting published every year. It used to be like in the 50s or something, there was hardly anything published, just a few things here and there. In the 60s, a little bit more. In the 70s, it started taking off. 80s, a lot more. And I mean, it's just exploded. The growth of publications has been exponential, basically. And that's the way it is, okay? We have a lot of smart people, a lot of researchers, a lot of scientists doing a lot of important work in a lot of different fields, and in psychology as well. It's very important, as you know, that the psychology has become even more and more important. There's a lot of people doing research. Something else you might want to look at is Medline with full text. It's just called Medline now, okay? A lot of the things that you're interested in that have to do with psychology are also medical in some way, like alcoholism. Sure, it's psychology related, but it also has to do with medicine. Or depression, Alzheimer's, all these things are also medical. So you can find information about them also in Medline. So Medline provides the authoritative medical information on medicine, nursing, dentistry, veterinary medicine, the healthcare system, and the preclinical sciences. A lot of those things, believe it or not, there are things related to psychology. Like I said, you know, medicine, come on, alcoholism, you know, marijuana use, or drug abuse of any kind, or drug use, okay? Dementia, Alzheimer's, lots of different things. I did research on alcohol and aggression, and I actually had to use Medline quite frequently to locate those studies that have been done in the medical field that have to do with alcohol. More than 1,470 journals indexed in Medline. Well, it's growing every year. There's more now, okay? I don't know the exact number. We don't need to know the exact number. There's a lot there. So you might want to search Medline as well. Using PsycInfo. Okay, so this is not what you're going to use, but if you're interested in using PsycInfo, there's a link to a video there if you need it, if you're somewhere where you're going to be using that, or if you have access to that. And the video is actually prepared by the American Psychological Association, the APA. PsycInfo's appearance and the process of accessing the database may differ from one computer system to another. It may differ, okay? Ask a teacher or reference librarian to help you. It could be here that what we use is actually accessing PsycInfo, but it's not called that. We actually use something here called EBSCOhost, or the EBSCOhost Discovery Service, where you search everything all at once, books and articles. And you can narrow down your search and just check off and say you want to search only in psychology. And when you do that, you are probably accessing a lot of things that are in PsycInfo, or maybe PsycInfo itself. Not sure how all this stuff is connected, but it's all connected. The literature is the literature, and you can access it from many different points. And, you know, it may look different in different places. Okay, screening articles during the literature search, ways to weed out irrelevant material. When you do your search, especially when you keep it general, let's say you do a search and you just type in depression and see what pops out. You're probably gonna get, you know, 100,000, more than 100,000 different search results. That's way too many. So you wanna narrow it down, okay? You can narrow it down by title. Maybe you're interested in depression, but maybe it's depression in, let's say, in adolescence, or maybe depression and academic performance. So you can narrow down the title, okay? You can also narrow down by abstract. Maybe you tell the, you know, the search engine there, or whatever you're using, whatever tool you're using, that you want the keywords to appear in the abstract. Because when you do a search by keyword and you don't narrow it down, those keywords could be anywhere in the article. And if you specify the keyword needs to be in the abstract, then it'll narrow it down a little bit more. Look for a link to a full text version, okay? Narrow it down to things that are full text, okay? There's plenty of stuff that's full text. You don't really want to waste your time with stuff that's not full text and just read a description of it. There's plenty of stuff full text. Narrow it down to that. Most things are full text now. If the article still looks relevant, then go ahead and read it. Read it carefully, okay? And then you can use the references. Look at the references of that article to help you find other things that are related. Because when you find one good article, okay, that is about what you're looking for, it's gonna mention other articles that are directly related. So you might wanna look at the references and then look for the authors, look for the title, and then you can actually look for those specific articles. You may not find it in whatever you're using, but there are ways to find it, okay? Chances are it exists somewhere. And you might have to actually go to a physical library, like UCLA's library or USC's library. You know, when you go to those places, those universities, they have several libraries, huge libraries that are, you know, it's like a big building, 10 stories tall, and they have so many books, so many articles. And if there's something that is credible or something that's, you know, science-based, that's actually, you know, real researchers doing real research work, that's published somewhere, chances are they have it. But most things are online nowadays. You don't actually have to go to those physical places. If you look hard enough, you can find it online. You may not find it using whatever tool you're using, like EBSCOhost or PsycInfo, whatever it is, it may not be there. Okay, it might be somewhere else. But come on, with the internet, there's a way to find it. Okay, you know, like I don't really want you to do a Google search, okay, or something like that. But if you look hard enough, you can find just about anything in Google. Okay, you can find the full text version of some article that you couldn't find, let's say, using EBSCOhost, whatever you're using to do your search. If you want something bad enough and you look for it hard enough, you can find it on the internet. That's just the way the internet is. Just about everything is available. Whether you're legally accessing it or not is another issue. Okay, whether the person who's putting that up there has the legal right to do so, that's another issue. But I want you to stick more, to the actual tools that are available through your library. Ending a literature search. When are you done? How do you know your search is complete? The search is complete when you feel comfortable with, with your knowledge on a specific area. When you've read enough to say, I think I understand here, what's going on. I think I really understand, this area of psychology. I think I understand depression, a little bit, or I understand aggressive behavior, or this specific topic, right? How, whether, you were interested in whether depression affects, let's say, academic performance. So you read several studies about that. Maybe you've even gone through some books, and you think you have a good idea of what is going on. And you found a few research studies that are recent, right, and relevant to your specific area of interest. How many articles is enough? The key criterion when you're actually going to do a real research study is that the study or studies that you find provide some justification for new research. You have found enough studies that you can say, well, based on all this work that's been done, I think that, this other study should be done. They've looked at this, this, and this, but they haven't really done this. They haven't looked at this specific thing. Or, they've shown that, yes, there are, there's studies that show that, that depression affects, GPA, that affects academic performance, that even affects memory, your ability to focus, affects, whether people attend class or not, all those things. But that research has mostly been done, with people at the university level. And which basically means it's, white participants that are relatively well off. Maybe we need to do that study with people in a community college setting, a more diverse population, a population that is not so economically privileged, and see if we find the same thing. Maybe they're better at coping with depression because life is tough for them already, and so maybe it's different for them, or maybe it's worse. Okay, but it's worth studying a different population. But how many is enough? What's enough is when you have a good grasp of a specific thing you want to look into. I will tell you though, for the paper that you have to do for this specific class, there is a specific number that you have to cite when you write your paper, and that is 5. You need at least 5 sources that are cited, and and then those same 5 sources have to be mentioned, listed in the references. So in the syllabus it says 5, but how many is enough? It depends. You need enough so that you can write a good introduction, okay? Make a good justification for what you are doing. Why are you looking into what you're looking into? Okay, so read about relevant research and see where it leads you. I will tell you that when you actually write something, when you do a real research study and you try to publish it, you will have dozens of basically sources that are cited, dozens of things in the references. If it's something more exhaustive, like what we call a literature review or even a meta-analysis, something like that, there could be hundreds of publications, hundreds of sources that are in the references, hundreds of sources cited. Finding an idea from a research study, from a published article. Some of your ideas, when you find these articles, your ideas can actually come from these published articles, okay? That's where it can come from, okay? So because authors sometimes, when you read these articles that you found, authors can make explicit statements regarding unanswered questions. So you look at the discussion section of the article, and they'll mention, oh yeah, we showed this and this, we found this and this, but we didn't really look at this. Or we had this problem, and that's something that could be addressed in future research. That can lead to an idea. Authors sometimes point out limitations or problems with their own studies. They'll point out that the study was done with mostly white people, white women specifically, and that are white participants that are relatively well off, because that's where research is done at the university level, and those people are relatively privileged. Sadly, it is still people who are economically disadvantaged are still make up a very small portion of those who go to a prestigious institution. That's the reality. Okay, so they point out that limitation, that they don't have a diverse population, or a population that's economically disadvantaged. So we say, okay, well, maybe that's who I should be looking at. Okay, and you have a perfect opportunity that, given where you live and the kind of college you go to. You can create an idea from two existing findings, right? Sometimes you have one study, one research article that suggests one thing about the area, and another research article that suggests something else, and they're at odds with one another. One research study says perhaps that when people become intoxicated, they get frustrated, they get angry, they're more likely to be aggressive. Another research study suggests that when people become intoxicated, they get happy and more extroverted. Okay, so why the disparity there? What's the difference? Maybe that can lead to an idea. I can tell you, well, the difference might be due to the fact that, those that became aggressive after becoming intoxicated were probably provoked. There's probably something that pissed them off. Versus, those people that actually drink and nothing pisses them off, they tend to actually, become disinhibited in different ways. Maybe more happy, more extroverted, more talkative. If no one pisses you off when you're drunk, things are relatively okay. You have a good time. But if people piss you off when you're drunk, there's probably going to be some trouble. Let's keep going. So, those are two different findings, both studies related to alcohol. And there's a reason why those different findings exist. Okay, so finding suggestions for future research. When you are familiar with the current research in an area, the idea for the next study simply involves extending the current research one more step. So you've read these articles and, where do you take it from there? Okay, so you extend the research one more step. This is not as simple as it sounds, okay? When you're an expert in the field, yes, you can do that. You know about your area, you're an expert in it, and you do a study, and you know where that's going to lead to next. You know what the next step is. For you, it's probably going to be the first time you do some research. So you reading about this research may not trigger some idea of something that you can look into. Okay, you may just need to do something that is just relatively simple. I suggest you do something simple and not try to reinvent the wheel. Don't try to do something complicated. Research nowadays that is worth publishing is actually not so simple. It used to be in the past that you could publish a simple study where you showed that alcohol increases aggression. Nowadays, to get something published, you need a lot more than that. You can't just be finding some simple thing like that. You can't just show that alcohol increases aggression. You have to show why, okay? What are some of the mediating variables? Or what are some of the moderators if you're talking about an experiment? It's not enough to just show some result. You can try to explain it if it's an experiment, okay? So you're not an expert, okay, it's your first time, so that's not gonna be so easy for you. So, but ideas are easy to find, okay? But the research can be complicated, and that might not be where your idea comes from. Your idea might come from, like I said before, a casual observation or something you're already interested in, not actually the research. Finding new research ideas is easily done by looking for them as explicit statements in journal articles you already have. Like I said, sometimes the new ideas, are already written there. The author specifically mentioned future research should look at this and this. Chances are, if they mention it, they're probably already working on it, because by the time you read that research article, it's been years since it's been published, and they're probably already working on it because they often mention, like I said, future research. It'd be worthwhile to look at this and this, and that's usually where they go next. They decide to basically do research on those specific things that they mention. Otherwise, why would they mention them? They're probably going to work on those. The discussion section. Check out the discussion section. The discussion section will often end with a set of suggestions for future research. That is where you find those suggestions in the discussion section of the research article. The authors usually point out the questions that remain unanswered. Okay, you can use these suggestions for ideas for your own research. These suggestions aren't always easy to test, however. Okay, this is usually sophisticated research. If you do try to answer some of those unanswered questions, you might do it in a very simple way. Okay, but they're usually not simple. The authors point out limitations, like I said, problems with their own study. You can use these study fixes to, try to fix these issues in your own research. Here are the components of a research article, where, just where you'll find information. There's the introduction, okay, where there's a literature review that is done where they summarize other people's work. Hypotheses are mentioned. Specific predictions are derived from those hypotheses. That's all done in the introduction. The method section describes participants and the procedure. We'll look at the method section later in the semester, and actually even the introduction. Right now, we're just talking about ideas, okay? And some of those ideas can come from reading introductory sections of the research article, which is why we're mentioning this. There's the results section where they describe what they found, and they mention statistics. And then there's a discussion section where you can find more ideas about doing research, right? Where we mentioned specific things are mentioned, specific ideas, future research, limitations of the study. Those can all be addressed, okay? And then references are just the references. So these are all the sources, the sections, not all the sections actually. We don't have the title page here and the abstract, but these are some of the sections of a research article, the components of a research article, where you can do some critical reading and find some ideas. The introduction, even looking at the method section, the procedure can help you spark some ideas, right, about how they did certain things, and maybe you want to do it a different way. The results, right, what did they find? Is it possible that those results are wrong, or maybe that if you did the study a different way, you can find different results? The discussion section, limitations are pointed out, okay, and specific future research is mentioned that could be done. And the references is basically where sources are listed that you might want to look up, okay? Because you read about something, it looks interesting, and you want to read the full article, okay? Rather than just a short one-sentence description of a study that's mentioned in the introduction. So you might want to look at the references. So these are all things that you can look at when you're trying to find ideas. Using a research idea to create a research study. Okay, we're gonna back up. We're gonna stop here, okay? I'm not gonna do it right now because I do not want to rush through it. But the next time we meet, I won't, I'll actually show you how to do a search. Just quickly how to do a search, and then we will talk about the next step, which is forming a hypothesis, okay? So first you wanna find an idea, and you search the literature for that, and I'm gonna show you how to search the literature. And then the next step, once you have your idea, is, basically to come up with a hypothesis, So that'll be next time. So I will end the lecture now and open it up for questions.